And to call my next guest a politics reporter for the Huffington Post or HuffPost would be doing him and you, the audience, a great injustice. He is so much more than that, including, among other things, an old friend and ally of this program. Daniel Marans is, in fact, a politics reporter for the Huffington Post and or HuffPost, and he's been doing terrific work. We wanted to have him on to talk about an interesting new bill that was recently released, spearheaded by Representative John Larson in the House on Social Security. So first of all, Daniel, thank you for coming back on the program.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Richard, I sense a lingering loyalty to Arianna in the way you have referred to my esteemed employer, and I'll explain what I mean. And Troy, actually, your producer, hit on that when we were chatting before the show, which is it's now called HuffPost because when the Queen is deposed, you change the street names. So we took her brand, we wrote it for 11 years, and now we're just Huff, like Huff the Magic Dragon. I'm sorry, that's Puff. But the point is, technically it's HuffPost, and yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well,
back in my old stomping grounds.
Yeah, I don't know if it's loyalty to Arianna, although I'm sure she would interpret it the same way as you did. But it's habit, I think, more than anything else. So it's HuffPost, and Huff the Magic Dragon is the brother of Puff the Magic Dragon. They were Huff and Puff the Magic Dragon. But in any event, we are not here to talk Arianna Huffington or Magic Dragons, but to talk about something called the Social Security 2100 Act. So tell us about it, if you would.
I will. The Social Security 2100 Act is a pretty ambitious bill to both expand benefits across the board and close the program's funding gaps so that it would continue to be able to pay scheduled benefits for at least the next 75 years, which is sort of what all the various budget hawks who are always concerned about the future of Social Security say they want. It would do that two ways, and I'll get a little bit more into exactly how it increases benefits. It also cuts taxes, the income taxes that are levied on Social Security benefits. I'll get to that as well. But in terms of the financing mechanisms, because I think that's an interesting piece of it, and it's something that, in theory, might be the sort of Achilles heel of it if we were talking in, let's say, 2010 or 2011, but seemingly is not stopping its momentum now, and that is that it would both lift the cap, and as we know, the taxable maximum on Social Security, or the cap as it's commonly called, the amount of ordinary earnings that are taxed with payroll taxes to pay into Social Security is now at 133 grand. And what Larson's bill would do is he would create a new floor at 400 grand where earnings above that would be subject to the payroll taxes, and people would get a little bit of benefits off of the earnings they put into it on that. And he also would actually increase the overall payroll tax by 2.4 percentage points. Now, that would be split evenly between employer and employee, and it would be phased in over 24 years, which Larson likes to say for someone making 50 grand a year would only cost you 50 cents a week or a Starbucks cup every 9 weeks. So that's the long and short of it. In terms of the benefits itself, the goodies, as I called it on Twitter, you've got sort of a tried and true classic, which is switching to a new cost of living adjustment formula that experts believe takes into account the expenses of older folks to a greater degree. It's called it's been experimental to this point in terms of how the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures it, but it's called the Consumer Price Index for the elderly, and that would increase, the Social Security Administration estimates, benefits by about 0.2% a year, but that effect compounds, of course. It would create a minimum benefit such that no one remains in poverty while still on Social Security, and that's especially important for people with inconsistent work histories, because Social Security takes your best 35 years. Some people haven't been in sort of the above board workplace that long and have had lower earnings, and they end up with a Social Security benefit that's less than 12 grand, which is the federal poverty level for an individual. And so it tops you off and says that there's a minimum benefit at 125% of the federal poverty level. And then it tinkers with the benefit formula as well. So it ticks up the replacement rate for your pre-retirement earnings on the low end of your earnings, such that you'd get about a higher benefit of 2% on average. I looked at some of the tables in the chief actuary scoring, the Social Security Administration's chief actuary scoring. For the poorest beneficiaries, as they get into late old age, assuming they claim at 65, they claim 20, 30 years from now, relative to current law, it could be as much as a 50% benefit increase. Now, that's somebody that's making a benefit of, let's say, 8 or 9 grand or 10 grand, but that's a huge impact on their life. And for other folks, it's generally more moderate. But it manages to do that while extending the lifespan of the program and raising the income threshold for income taxes on Social Security benefits, which is, in some ways maybe a sop to the more, I suppose you could say the more moderate side of the crowd who always loves to cut taxes. But he makes a good point, which is that the sort of bracket, currently the exemption is, I think, frankly, the exact number escapes me, but I think it's like 10 or 15 grand. Your first 10 or 15 grand, and you're exempt from income taxes on your benefits. And that 10 or 15 grand is your whole income. He would raise it to 50 grand for an individual, 100 grand for a couple. And he does make the point that that bracket was never indexed. That exemption was never indexed. So we're getting real wonkish here.
Right.
I've laid it out. I would say it's not necessarily the most generous of the various plans I've ever read in terms of like benefit increases, but it combines it with this huge solvency extension. And he's managed to get loads of moderate Democrats and others on board. More than 200 people. I mean, if you get more than 200 members of the caucus on board, you pretty much got everybody from every which corner, because you can't get that many. Yeah.
And you can also, when you've got that many co-sponsors, you're pretty much guaranteed a passage if it's going to, I would think, if it's going to go to the floor, because your co-sponsors alone get you a good part of the way. And how many people, when a bill comes to the floor that's fiscally, quote unquote, responsible and expands Social Security benefits, how many Democrats are going to say, nah, I don't want to sign on to that? I mean, you'd really be stepping up to some trouble. So here's my take on everything you just said, Daniel Marans. First of all, as you well know, the entire debate around deficit spending and in the federal budget and so on has changed dramatically in recent years. Social Security is separately funded and it's paid for through the payroll tax, so it's held to a higher standard than, say, the military budget, as Anthony Wedgwood Benn, Anthony Wedgwood Benn, Tony Benn in Great Britain said. No general said, I'd love to bomb Baghdad, but I don't have the budget. Social Security is held to a much higher standard. This meets that standard. It nods to the center a little bit, because a lot of people do complain about the taxation on benefits with considerable justification. And so it seems to me, breaking it all down, maybe we'll go back a little bit to the details, but the gist of this seems to be that this is a very progressive bill overall. It does expand benefits, and yet it's been put together. My impression of Representative Larson is that he is a moderate Democrat in the current use of that term. He's not on the left wing of the party generally, but he's got a very progressive bill that he's managed to make appealing to other moderate or centrist Democrats because of the quote unquote fiscal responsibility dimension of it. Is Is that what you think is going on or not?
Okay, so I would hit on a couple things right there. In terms of the bill's appeal, I would just say that everybody kind of it's looking more and more like the sort of post 2010 period of deficit hysteria and austerity was actually an aberration in the history of Democratic Party politics. People have figured out, whether they're sort of classic corporate business friendly Democrats like Jim Himes, the former chairman of the New Democrat Coalition, or Terry Sewell, the former Goldman Sachs banker who represents Birmingham, Alabama, or Connor Lamb, is sort of an original co-sponsor and a co-chair of the Expand Social Security Caucus, that Social Security is a winner, that it's a political winner, even in tough districts. And so I would say that more than the fiscal responsibility itself is, I think, what's really behind this. And I think there's also just a greater understanding of the challenges in the retirement income and retirement security space. I would say the fiscal responsibility helps make it more palatable to those folks. And then, to talk about John Larson for a second, I think that that's important. Well, I spoke to him for this story on Tuesday, and was it Tuesday? I guess it was Tuesday, yeah. And I said to him, I was like, when did you start introducing this? And he said 2013, 2014. He wasn't at the cutting edge, sort of the folks that in 2010, 2011 who were really willing to throw down on this, Bernie Sanders, Keith Ellison, Raul Grijalva, but those guys wouldn't be able to, I think, command this level of a consensus. But even he admitted sort of in diplomatic ways that the debate had evolved. And I think, in trying to peg him within the House Democratic Caucus, I wouldn't call him really, I guess I would call him a moderate maybe by today's standards, right? I don't think he's on HR 676, the single payer bill. He represents the insurance capital of the country,
right.
And he's always in Hartford, and he's always basically been kind of like an old labor Dem leadership guy. He's the former chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. And that's, if you're that and then you're chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee on Ways and Means, it gives a good sense of where you stand. But given the fact that Nancy Pelosi calls the shots, that's a damn good place to be. And my understanding is Larson and the Progressive Caucus feel pretty confident that this goes to the floor for a vote, and that it passes eventually, with giving enough hall passes to the 10 or 12 Democrats who they can afford to lose on that. And more evidence of that was the fact that Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal, or Richie Neal as everybody seems to call him, was at the sort of big press conference and rollout for this yesterday morning. He's a guy who is not exactly the leftiest guy.
Right.
He's from Massachusetts. He's been around forever. It takes a ton of corporate money, seen as being cozy with the corporations. But Social Security, that's one thing where he gets it, or he certainly likes to convey that he gets it, because he grew up, actually, he benefited from what was then the student benefit, where his father passed away, and he was able to carry over children's survivors benefits to contribute toward his higher education.
But of course, just to jump in for a second, Paul Ryan benefited from the same the same Social Security feature, and he tried to gut it any way he could. So
Lindsey Graham as well.
Lindsey Graham, oh my God! So in the couple minutes we have left, I want to shift gears slightly, because on the same topic, which is we could, everything you're saying, Daniel, makes me think more and more about this idea that's kind of been bubbling around in my head, that there's a new kind of blue-collar Democrat being synthesized by history and events and politics and so on. And that is the Connor Lamb. A lot of people tried to, in the Democratic Party establishment, tried to appropriate Connor Lamb's victory as being a victory for in a blue collar swing district, you got to go conservative. He's one of us. But Connor Lamb's not only strong on Social Security and one of the driving forces behind the Larson bill, but he was also very pro-union, strong on some other quote unquote left issues as
Let's say
well.
prescription drugs.
Prescription drugs.
He's solid on.
Yeah, you've got stories about Richie Neal, defying Pelosi on not slow walking some of these. Maybe they were your stories actually, but and not slow walking one or two bills. So while we all are interested, fascinated by and tracking the new generation of Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and so on, and we should be, I'm wondering if we aren't also underplaying or missing out slightly on the people like Neil, like John Larson, like Connor Lamb now, who are signs of yet another kind of Democrat that doesn't fit into the pre-existing categories, but is kind of the return of the blue-collar Dem.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm a little hesitant to overinterpret there because so many of the people that did win in red districts or swing districts do not have the kind of labor density that Connor Lamb had in his district. And so many of the test cases that the left really hoped would show that an inclusive populist message could win and flip those Republican districts did not succeed. And I'm thinking of Randy Bryce in Wisconsin, Richard Ojeda in West Virginia, Liz Watson in Southern Indiana. So any Democrats flipping a House seat in Ohio, so it's a little tricky to overinterpret in that regard. This was still fundamentally a Democratic wave driven by affluent, educated suburbs and candidates that arguably reflect those preferences best. There are some exceptions, and Lamb's district is interesting in that regard. Though it's worth noting that the district he won in the special election was a district Trump won in by 19.5 points. He was subsequently redistricted due to a court ruling into a district where Trump won by only 3, and then won by double digits on election day. But he still has some real blue-collar pockets in parts of Allegheny County and I would say Beaver County, certainly, where his margin was thinnest. That's sort of a rural steel county right on the border with Ohio. It's certainly something to keep an eye out for. And I think, what you point out with Larson and Neal, and this is a really interesting piece of this, is, the way I like to think of it, and I don't want to downplay the fact at all that the majority of the working class in this country is Latino and Black, right? And that getting folks who in those communities who don't vote to vote at all is, and frankly in the poor white communities as well, is as much and should be as much, if not more, a part of an electoral strategy as it is keeping however many of the sort of proverbial Obama-Trump voters in the fold.
Right.
But there is room to do that in some places, and I think Connor Lamb wields the Marine uniform quite a bit, and that's may he loves God and Catholicism, and that may make some people hold their nose, but he pairs it with sort of a kind of a pro-labor Democratic Party politics in places like John Larson and Richie Neal's districts in New England. I think the way they've kept white people in the fold is that labor never went away, and politicians like that never quite went away, and so you have people walking into the voting booth feeling more like workers than like white people first.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but I think, if you're willing, I'll have to have you back, because I also think that some of this tests that you describe were kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of, you got to look at where the money went and where it didn't go, but you make a great point. So it's something to watch and something to keep talking about. And as always, Daniel Marans, great to read your writing and great talking to you. So thanks for coming on the program.
It's great as always, Richard. I'm happy to come on anytime.